Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a quiet Friday afternoon at St. Thomas High, a private school nestled in the woods just outside the city. The kind of school where the creaky floors and old dim hallways seemed to hold whispers of forgotten secrets. For most students, it was a typical day, but for a small group of seniors, it would become a nightmare that none of them would ever forget. They had decided to stay late for some extra studying, knowing their final exams were just around the corner. There were only a handful of students left in the building when the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The last bus had already left, and the school felt eerily empty. At first, no one thought much of it. They were used to the school being quiet, but the silence that hung over the hallways was different that night, unnaturally still. As the hours wore on, the group of friends split up, some heading to the library, others to classrooms or the small study hall. Among them was Mia, a quiet girl who usually kept to herself. She sat in the back corner of one of the older classrooms, a space rarely used anymore. The dim fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. The low hum of the lights was the only sound, other than the occasional rustle of paper or the tapping of pens. But then, she heard something strange, a noise. Faint at first, just barely audible. It sounded like the creak of a door. She froze, convinced she was imagining it, but then the noise came again, louder this time, like a slow dragging sound followed by the softest whisper of footsteps, as if someone was walking on the other side of the room. Mia stood up, her heart racing. She glanced around, but saw nothing unusual. The room was empty. Confused, she stepped out into the hallway, thinking maybe someone was just messing around. She expected to see her friends, maybe one of the teachers, but the hallway was dark and deserted. The only thing that caught her attention was a strange smell, a faint odor, like something rotting that seemed to hang in the air. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A door at the end of the hallway, one that was always kept locked, was slightly ajar. It was a small, nondescript room that no one ever used, but Mia knew it was supposed to be locked. It was an old storage room, filled with forgotten textbooks, equipment, and other discarded items. Compelled by an odd mixture of fear and curiosity, Mia walked toward the door. The closer she got, the more she could feel a strange chill in the air. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment before pushing it open just enough to peek inside. What she saw made her gasp. The room was filled with the unmistakable scent of decay. Papers were scattered across the floor, some torn, others half burned. But the most disturbing thing was the old, wooden chair in the center of the room. It was tilted slightly, as if someone had been sitting there recently. And on the floor beneath it, there was a trail of what looked like dark, dried stains leading off into the shadows. Mia stepped back in horror, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was happening, but something was terribly wrong. She quickly turned to leave, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of something in the hallway behind her, a figure standing motionless just out of the light. It was tall, thin, and unnervingly still. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She knew she wasn't imagining it. The figure hadn't been there a moment ago. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs were frozen, unable to move. Then the figure stepped forward, and Mia saw it clearly. It was a man, but not one who should have been there. His eyes were hollow, dark, and sunken, and his face was twisted in an unsettling grin. His skin was pale, almost deathly, and his clothes, old and tattered, looked as though they had been worn for decades. Mia stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, and fell to the ground. The figure took another step closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Just as he reached her, she finally managed to scream, the sound echoing through the hallway. But when the rest of the students rushed to her side, there was no one there. The hallway was empty once again, as if the figure had never been there at all. Mia was left shaken, her mind struggling to make sense of what had happened. But she wasn't the only one who had experienced something strange that night. Over the following days, several other students reported hearing odd noises, seeing shadowy figures in the corners of their vision, and feeling a cold, oppressive presence in the hallways. No one could explain it, and the teachers seemed oblivious, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. It wasn't until weeks later that the truth came out. Years before, a janitor had gone missing from the school. No one knew exactly what had happened to him, but rumors had circulated that he had been involved in some kind of strange, dark ritual. Some said he had been a part of a cult. Others believed he had lost his mind. The official story was that he had simply disappeared, but the truth was far more sinister. The janitor had been found dead in that very storage room, his body mutilated and his face frozen in a grotesque expression. It was said that his spirit still haunted the halls, seeking revenge on those who dared to enter the room. No one stayed late in that part of the school anymore. Mia never returned to that hallway, and neither did any of her friends. The room remained locked, the door never to be opened again, but the whispers of what happened that night still linger, echoing through the empty halls of St. Thomas High. And sometimes, just as the sun sets, a faint dragging sound can still be heard, creeping through the darkened corridor.
Story number 2.
It was the first week of the new school year at Oak Ridge Academy, a prestigious boarding school tucked away in the hills of a remote town. The students were excited for the fresh start, eager to make new friends, and quickly fall into the routine of academic life. But for a group of sophomores who were assigned to the older, more secluded dormitory building, the start of the year would soon turn into a terrifying experience. The dormitory, a sprawling, Gothic structure with high ceilings and narrow hallways, had been in use for over a century. The building was known for its history. Old portraits of long-dead alumni lining the walls, thick wooden doors creaking with the slightest draft, and a silence that seemed to seep into the bones of anyone who stayed there for too long. Some of the older students had warned the sophomores about strange occurrences in the building, things that couldn't easily be explained. At first, the stories were just rumors, passed along in whispers when no teachers were around. They spoke of strange noises in the middle of the night, things going missing, and flickering lights in the hallways. The most common story, however, was that of the girl who had died there years ago. The story went that a girl named Eleanor had been a student at Oak Ridge Academy in the 1920s. She had been a loner, known for spending her time in the library and avoiding the social scene. One night, during a snowstorm that had trapped everyone in the dormitory, Eleanor disappeared. She was found days later in one of the building's forgotten attic spaces, her body twisted in unnatural ways, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror. No one could explain how she had ended up there, and her death was ruled an accident. But the legends began soon after, and whispers claimed Eleanor's restless spirit haunted the dormitory, unable to move on. The sophomores, skeptical but intrigued, didn't think much of the stories. But soon, odd things began happening to them. It started with the sounds. Late at night, when the rest of the dormitory was supposed to be asleep, a faint scratching noise would echo through the hallways. It wasn't the typical creaking of an old building. It sounded deliberate, almost like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. At first, the group thought it was just one of the other students playing a prank, but the noises continued, growing louder each night. Then, personal belongings started to go missing. It was small things at first, a pair of socks, a notebook, a set of keys. But it didn't take long before the items that vanished were far more significant. Wallets, phones, and even a backpack that one student had left on her bed. It seemed as though they just disappeared into thin air. But the most chilling thing was the feeling they started to get. It was subtle at first, just an unease when walking down the hallways or entering their rooms, but it grew more intense. It felt as though someone was watching them at all times, their every move being tracked by unseen eyes. One night, as the group sat in their dorm room trying to study, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped, the air turned icy cold, and their breath became visible in the dim light of the desk lamps. The door to their room slammed shut with a force that shook the entire frame. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Panic set in, and the students scrambled to get out of the room. As they opened the door, they were confronted by something they couldn't explain. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure, a girl in a long, flowing white dress, her back turned to them. The figure was motionless, completely still. One of the students, Sarah, tried to call out to her, but no words came out. As they stood there, staring, the figure slowly turned to face them. The girl's face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow, empty eyes. Her lips were twisted into an agonizing expression, her mouth slightly open as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came. The air around them grew thick, and a chill settled in their bones. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever as they backed away, too terrified to move. Before they could escape, the figure vanished into the shadows. The group fled the dormitory that night, not stopping until they reached the main building. They didn't sleep, too shaken to rest. They spent the rest of the night trying to convince themselves that it was a trick of the mind, some kind of collective hallucination. But deep down, they knew what they had seen was real. The next morning, the group returned to the dormitory with a faculty member. They had hoped to find some logical explanation to prove that what they had witnessed was nothing more than a combination of fear and exhaustion. But when they reached the room, everything was normal. Their belongings were untouched, the door was open, and the hallway was quiet. The faculty member reassured them that there was nothing to fear, but the students weren't convinced. They knew what they had experienced was not of this world. That night, they gathered again in their dorm room, this time determined to stay awake and confront whatever was haunting them. The noises started again, soft at first, then louder. The scratching sounds grew closer, as if something was crawling across the floor beneath them. When they went to check the hallway, the figure appeared once more, standing at the end of the corridor. This time, however, she was closer than ever before. As she moved toward them, her hollow eyes seemed to pierce right through them, her cold presence suffocating the air around them. In an instant, the students realized they couldn't run. There was no escape. The door slammed shut behind them, and the room went dark. When the lights flickered back on, the students were gone. The school tried to explain it away as a simple case of students sneaking off, but the truth was far darker. No one has seen or heard from those students again. The dormitory remains closed off, and to this day, the whisper of Eleanor's name echoes in the halls, waiting for the next group to wander into her trap. And occasionally, just after midnight, you can still hear the faint scratching coming from deep within the wall.
Story number 3.
It was a stormy October evening when the students of Hillside Academy began to experience something that no one could explain. The small private school was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods, and was infamous for its eerie atmosphere. The old brick building had stood for over 100 years, with generations of students passing through its cold, stone hallways. But there was something unsettling about this particular year, something that none of the students could shake. Lena, a quiet junior, had always found comfort in the routine of school life. She would spend her evenings in the library, reading in peace, a welcome escape from her home life. But this year, the library seemed different. It wasn't that the books had changed or the layout had shifted. It was something more subtle, like a heaviness in the air, a feeling of being watched. It all started with the whispers. At first, Lena thought it was just the wind, or maybe the older students talking among themselves. But one evening, as she was sitting at a table near the back of the library, the whispers became clearer. She could hear fragments of words. Leave. Don't stay. It's too late. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, but when she turned around, no one was there. She chalked it up to the wind or perhaps exhaustion. But as the days passed, the whispers continued, and they grew louder. They weren't just in the library anymore. She began to hear them in the hallways, in her dorm room, and even during class when the teacher's back was turned. Lena wasn't the only one who noticed. Her friends, Jake and Emily, had begun hearing things too. Jake, who usually shrugged off the paranormal, seemed deeply unsettled. Emily, the skeptic of their group, couldn't deny that something was wrong. They decided to investigate. The three of them gathered one evening after dinner, making their way to the basement of the school. The basement was off limits to students, but that never stopped curious ones. They had heard strange stories about the space beneath the school, rumors of forgotten classrooms, hidden passages, and most chilling of all, an old, boarded-up room that no one had ever been able to open. The air grew colder as they descended the stairs, the temperature dropping sharply with each step. The basement was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long shadows on the walls. The scent of mildew hung in the air, and the floor was damp from the constant humidity. As they walked deeper into the basement, the whispers began again, but this time they were louder, clearer, more desperate. "Leave this place," the whispers urged. "You don't know what's down here." The group stopped at the foot of the stairs, unsure of where to go next. At the far end of the basement, behind a rusted locked door, was the source of the rumors, the hidden room. Lena could see faint markings on the walls near the door, symbols that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Jake, always the brave one, approached the door. "We have to know what's behind it," he muttered, his voice tense. With a creak, the door swung open, revealing a small, dark room. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the walls were covered in strange, faded writing. The room itself was almost completely empty, except for a single old wooden chair in the center and an ancient-looking book resting on the seat. Emily reached out, hesitant. "It feels wrong, like we're not supposed to be here." But Jake, overcome by a sense of curiosity, picked up the book. It was heavy, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. As he opened it, a cold wind seemed to blow through the room, despite the lack of windows. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if they were coming from the very walls. Then, Lena saw it. A shadow moved across the far corner of the room, something dark and tall, towering over them. It seemed to stretch and shift like smoke, forming a figure that was too large to be real. The figure's face was obscured, but Lena could feel its eyes, burning into her soul. "Put it down!" Lena screamed. "Put the book down!" Jake, frozen in place, didn't respond. The shadow moved closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted, turning their breath to fog. The whispers, now a chorus of anguished voices, filled the space, and Lena could hear them begging for release, pleading for someone to take the book away from the room. Emily rushed forward and grabbed the book from Jake's hands, tossing it across the room. As soon as it hit the floor, the shadow let out an ear-piercing screech. The temperature rose back to normal, and the whispers abruptly stopped, leaving a terrifying silence in their wake. The group ran from the basement, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They didn't stop until they were back in their dorm room, locked safely inside. They didn't speak for a long time, all too terrified to put their thoughts into words. The air in their room felt oppressive, like something was waiting just outside the door. The next day, Lena found herself alone in the library again, unable to focus on her work. She glanced at the clock, realizing she had been there for hours. But when she stood to leave, something caught her eye. It was a shadow, standing by one of the bookshelves, watching her. She froze, heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, the shadow moved closer. It wasn't a student, and it wasn't a teacher. It was the same dark, shapeless figure she had seen in the basement. The figure didn't make a sound as it approached, its face still hidden from view. Lena backed away, too terrified to scream. She turned to run, but the shadow was already there, right in front of her. It reached out with long, skeletal fingers, its touch icy cold, and then everything went black. The next morning, Lena's friends found the library door locked from the inside. When they finally managed to break it open, they found Lena lying motionless on the floor, her eyes wide open in terror, staring at nothing. No one could explain what happened to her, but some of the older students claimed that the shadow had claimed her. They said it was the curse of the book, that whoever touched it would be marked, their soul trapped within the library forever. And from that day on, the whispers didn't just haunt the halls of Hillside Academy. They began to follow the students wherever they went, urging them to open the book and let it claim another soul.